The summer of 1883 burned across the Arizona territory like a judgment. It was the kind of heat that baked the truth right out of the ground, leaving nothing but dust and lies. On a ranch 20 miles from anything that called itself a town, Thomas Reich stood on his porch and watched the world shimmer. He was a man carved from hardship, a Civil War veteran who'd traded the ghosts of Gettysburg for the ghosts of the Apache, on land that had once been theirs. The irony was as thick as the dust, and that's when he saw her. A lone figure walking out of the heat haze, straight-backed and steady, as if the sun had no claim on her. Long black hair coated in the pale red dust of his land. Thomas felt the familiar weight of instinct pull his hand toward the rifle leaning against the door frame. Strangers out here were a currency he couldn't afford. They usually came to take something. She stopped 10 paces from his porch steps. Her eyes locked on his, and in that moment the world went silent. He'd seen other native women, usually in town, eyes downcast, moving like whispers at the edge of the world. Not her. Her gaze was a physical thing, a challenge. Dark, unwavering, and holding a shadow he recognized from his own mirror. The look of someone who had seen the end of things and decided to walk on anyway. "This is private property," Thomas said. His voice came out like grinding stone. Her reply was simple, stripped of any plea. "I need work." He let his eyes drift over her. Trail-worn buckskin pants, a faded cotton shirt, hands that were calloused and capable. She wasn't asking for a handout. She was making a statement. Still a native woman, alone, asking a white man for a job. It was a lit match in a barn full of dry hay. It would start whispers, then shouts. But his last 3 hands had chased rumors of gold to California, and the ranch was bleeding work. Something in her stillness, in the raw granite of her stare, told him she hadn't come to his door by chance. She'd chosen it. "Got a name?" he asked. "Isla." The silence stretched, pulled taut by the heat. Every sensible part of him screamed to send her away, to point her down the road and forget he ever saw her face. But the rancher in him saw a pair of willing hands, and the lonely man in him saw something else, something he hadn't felt since his wife, Martha, was put in the ground. He finally broke the silence with the most practical question he could think of. "Any experience with animals?" Isla's lips, chapped and dry, parted. Her voice was the sound of the parched earth itself. "Only wild ones." The words hung between them, a second meaning coiled inside the first. Thomas pretended not to feel the jolt, the sudden sharp understanding that passed between them. He pretended it was just a strange answer from a strange woman. But he knew it wasn't. And deep inside him, a door he'd nailed shut years ago began to creak open. He told himself it was just curiosity. He was wrong. "Bunkhouse is around back," he heard himself say, the words feeling like they belonged to another man. "Meals and $5 a month. First sign of trouble, you're gone." She gave a single sharp nod. No smile, no thanks. Just a quiet acceptance, as if the terms were already known to her. As he watched her walk away, her silhouette cutting a sharp line against the brutal afternoon sun, Thomas told himself it was a business decision, a simple matter of necessity. He needed help, she needed work, nothing more. It was the first of many lies he would tell himself about Isla Blackwater. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that 50 miles south, a U.S. Marshal named Cobb was pinning a wanted poster to a board. The sketch was crude, but the eyes were right. The poster described an Apache woman, wanted for the murder of a cavalry soldier, a soldier who had a reputation, a soldier whose powerful father was a senator. The bounty was $500, dead or alive, and the marshal had a fresh lead, a trail heading north, straight toward Reich Ranch. That night, as the sun bled out across the horizon, Isla laid her bedroll in the dusty bunkhouse. It wasn't much, but it was a roof. She pulled a small, worn leather pouch from her belongings and a knife from a sheath on her calf. The steel caught the last rays of light, hungry and cold. She wasn't just looking for work. She was looking for a place to disappear, a place to wait, because she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were coming for her. The work was just a means to an end. The ranch was a hiding place, and the rancher, he was a complication she hadn't planned for. Tomorrow would bring horses and fences and sweat, but tonight brought only the memory of a soldier's dying gasp and the cold, hard promise she'd made to her people. She would not be taken. She would survive, whatever it took. The sky was still a bruised purple when Thomas found her in the stables. She wasn't mucking out stalls or throwing hay. She was just standing there in front of the pen holding Diablo. The stallion was a devil, a black beast of muscle and fury that had thrown every man who'd ever dared to climb on his back. He was a whirlwind of hooves and teeth. But now he was standing perfectly still. His head was lowered, his ears pricked forward. Listening. Isla was speaking to him, not in English, but in the soft, rhythmic syllables of Apache. It wasn't a command, it was a conversation. "That horse is pure poison," Thomas said from the doorway, startling himself with the sound of his own voice in the pre-dawn quiet. "Thrown every man I've had." Isla didn't turn. She just kept her eyes on the horse. Then they didn't ask properly. Over the next week, Thomas learned what she meant. His old hands had used ropes, spurs, and brute force. They had tried to break the horse's spirit. Isla used something else entirely. She used time. For hours, she would just sit on a stool outside Diablo's stall, sometimes reading a tattered English book she kept in her pocket, other times just being there, a silent, steady presence. She never tried to touch him. She just let him get used to the shape of her, the smell of her, the quiet rhythm of her breathing. On the third day, Diablo stopped pacing and watched her. On the fifth day, he took a piece of apple from her outstretched palm, his velvety lips surprisingly gentle. On the seventh day, she opened the stall door, swung herself onto his bare back, and rode him out into the corral. No saddle, no bridle, just her hands tangled in his black mane and a low word spoken into his ear. Thomas watched from the fence, his morning coffee forgotten in his hand. They moved together, woman and horse, a single fluid creature dancing across the dust. It wasn't domination. It was an agreement. When she finally slid off his back, her shirt clinging to her skin, her face serene, he had to ask, "Where in God's name did you learn to do that?" "My father taught me," she said, her gaze distant. "He said a horse knows what's in your heart before you do." It was the most she'd ever told him about her past. It was a key, turning a lock he didn't even know existed. He started noticing other things. The way she would face the rising sun each morning, a silent prayer on her lips. The way she could walk through the brush and point out which plants would heal a fever and which would stop a man's heart. She worked with a fierce, tireless energy, never complaining, never asking for praise. She simply was, a part of the land he only thought he owned. But something else was happening, something dangerous. At the dinner table, the small kitchen would shrink until it was just the two of them. The air grew thick, charged with unspoken things. He'd find his eyes drawn to her hands as she ate, strong and sure. Sometimes she'd catch him watching, and her dark eyes would hold his for a beat too long, sending a jolt straight through him. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was loud. It was hungry. One afternoon, returning from a supply run in town, he took the path by the creek, and he saw her. She was bathing, the late sun turning the water to liquid gold as it streamed over her copper skin. Her long black hair was loose, cascading down her back. He should have turned away. A decent man would have. A smart man would have. Thomas Reich just stood there, hidden by the cottonwoods, and watched. He felt like a trespasser on his own land. He didn't move until she suddenly stiffened, her head lifting as if she'd scented him on the wind. She turned, and her eyes found him in the shadows. There was no fear in her gaze, no shame, just a calm, unnerving acknowledgement. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. A question was asked, and an answer was given, all without a single word. That night he knocked over his water glass when their fingers brushed, as they both reached for the salt. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense quiet. He felt like a clumsy boy, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was spiraling out of his control. "Calf in the south pasture," he said, his voice rough. "Mother rejected it. Need your help with it tomorrow." It was an excuse, a desperate attempt to make things normal again. She just nodded, but he saw the faint flush on her high cheekbones. He told himself it was just the heat from the stove. Another lie. Later, lying alone in the big, empty bed that had been his and Martha's, Thomas finally admitted the truth to himself. The truth he'd been fighting for weeks. He wanted her, not just in the way a lonely man wants a woman. It was more than that. He wanted her silence, her strength, her untamable spirit. He wanted to know the story behind the haunted look in her eyes. And that desire, that raw, powerful wanting, scared him more than any rebel cannon fire ever had. In the bunkhouse, Ela lay on her cot, one hand resting on the hilt of the knife hidden beneath her pillow. She could still feel his eyes on her from the trees by the creek. He was a white man, a settler. He represented everything that had taken her world apart. He should be her enemy. So why did she see the same loneliness in his eyes that she felt in her own soul? Why did he remind her of the unyielding mountains of her home? Solid, weathered, permanent. She'd come here to hide, not to feel. But the storm that had been gathering between them was about to break, and she wasn't sure either of them would survive it. Just then, a rider dismounted in the nearest town, 20 miles away. It was Marshal Cobb. He was tired, he was thirsty, and he was getting impatient. He walked into the saloon and slapped a few coins on the bar. "I'm looking for an Apache woman," he announced to the bartender. "Passed through here recently, maybe." The bartender shook his head. "Ain't seen one." But a drunk ranch hand at the end of the bar, one of the men Thomas had fired, piped up. "I seen one. Reich hired her. Lives out at his place." Marshal Cobb's eyes narrowed. He pushed a silver dollar across the bar to the drunk. "Tell me more." The hunt was on. The sky tore open without warning. 1 minute it was a peaceful, star-dusted night. The next it was a raging war of thunder and lightning. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. A sudden, terrified bellow from the south pasture cut through the storm's fury. The new calf, the one its mother had rejected. Thomas grabbed a lantern and burst out of the house. Isla was already there, a silhouette against the violent flashes of light, her hair whipping around her face. They didn't need to speak. They both ran, splashing through the instant mud, toward the sound. They found the calf sinking in a bog, its frightened cries weak against the roaring wind. Working together in the chaos, they were a seamless unit. He used his strength to heave. She used her knowledge to find purchase for the animal's flailing legs. They were soaked, caked in mud, their hands finding each other in the dark to pull and guide. Finally, with one last coordinated effort, they dragged the terrified creature onto solid ground. They stumbled back to the barn, the little calf wobbling behind them, the storm still raging. Inside, the world was suddenly quiet, muffled by the walls and the thick smell of hay and rain. Isla slipped on the muddy floor. Thomas reached out, grabbing her arm to steady her, and he didn't let go. The lantern cast flickering shadows on their faces. They were panting, their breath mingling in the cool air. Mud, rain, and something else, something wild and electric, passed between them. For a single, stretched-out heartbeat, they just stood there, his hand gripping her arm, the entire world held in that one point of contact. Then the dam broke. He didn't pull her to him. They crashed together, a collision of unspoken need and suppressed desire. His hands were in her wet hair, his mouth finding hers with a desperate, bruising force, her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers digging into his shoulders, meeting his hunger with her own. This wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a raw, primal claiming. Months of tension, weeks of stolen glances, years of loneliness, it all exploded in that one instant. "This is a mistake," she gasped against his lips, but her body betrayed her words, pressing closer. "I stopped making smart decisions the day you walked onto this ranch," he breathed back, and then there were no more words. What happened on the floor of that barn was as fierce and cleansing as the storm outside. There was no gentleness, no hesitation. It was the raw, undeniable truth of two people who had been starving for something they didn't even know they needed. It was survival. It was solace. It was a reckoning. Afterward, lying in the hay, her head on his chest, listening to the thunder of his heart match the slowing thunder outside, Isla felt a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it. Peace. The constant, gnawing fear that had been her companion for months had finally gone silent. In the arms of this man, this enemy, this stranger, she felt safe. The next morning the world was washed clean. The storm had passed. Thomas walked to the bunkhouse, gathered Isla's few belongings, and carried them into the main house. He placed them in the bedroom that had been empty for 3 long years. He didn't say a word to the 2 remaining ranch hands. He didn't have to. Their sideways glances and sudden silence said it all. In the quiet privacy of the house, Thomas and Isla started to build a new world. It was a world with a language made of touches, of shared glances, of comfortable silences. During the day, they worked the ranch side by side, a perfect, unspoken partnership. At night, they explored each other's scars, the ones on the skin and the ones deep inside. He learned the ridges on her back from a childhood fall. She learned the puckered scar on his shoulder from a mini ball. Isla never spoke of why she was running, and Thomas never asked. He didn't want to know the crime. He only wanted to know the woman. But sometimes she'd wake up in the dark, gasping, a name tangled in a language he didn't understand. On those nights he would just pull her close, holding her until the trembling stopped, until her breathing evened out. It was the only comfort he had to offer. It was enough. But their fragile peace was built on borrowed time. It was a beautiful, impossible bubble, and it was about to burst. Marshal Cobb rode slow, taking his time. He'd learned a thing or two about hunting men and women. Rushing only spooked the prey. He spent a day in town, listening. He heard about the widower Reich, a man who kept to himself. He heard about the wild stallion no one could ride, now tame as a kitten. And he heard about the Apache woman who worked like 2 men and spoke to horses in her own tongue. Cobb wasn't a fool. The pieces clicked into place. The timing was too perfect. This woman wasn't just a ranch hand. He could feel it in his gut. He bought a week's worth of supplies. He wasn't going to ride up to the ranch and ask. He was going to watch. He found a high ridge a few miles from the Reich homestead, a spot hidden by juniper and rock that gave him a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire ranch. He settled in, his spyglass polished and ready. He would learn their routines, their weaknesses. He was a patient man. And the $500 bounty, plus the private, much larger reward promised by the dead soldier's senator father, made him very patient indeed. He watched them mend fences together. He watched them herd cattle. And one evening, through his powerful lens, he watched Thomas Reich pull Isla into his arms on the porch, a gesture of quiet intimacy that spoke volumes. This wasn't a boss and his hired hand. This was something else entirely. Cobb smiled. This made things much, much easier. Reich wasn't just harboring a fugitive. He was in love with one. And love made men stupid. 2 months they lived like that, in their self-contained world. Thomas started teaching her to read English better, his rough finger tracing the words in an old newspaper. She showed him how to make a poultice from yucca root that eased the ache in his war-wounded leg. They weren't husband and wife. They weren't lovers in the traditional sense. They were two survivors, clinging to a piece of driftwood in a raging sea. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, the bubble burst. A dust cloud on the horizon, moving steadily toward them. A single rider. As he got closer, the sun glinted off something on his chest, a badge. Thomas's blood went cold. He'd been a soldier. He knew the look of a man on a mission. And this man was riding like he already knew the outcome. "Go inside, stay in the bedroom, don't make a sound," he said to Isla, his voice low and urgent. She'd been brushing Diablo in the corral. She saw the look on his face, looked to the approaching rider, and her body went rigid. She didn't argue. She simply melted into the shadows of the house, her hand instinctively going to the knife she always kept tucked in her boot. Thomas stood on the porch, waiting. He made his posture relaxed, his hands loose at his sides. He looked like a simple rancher, tired from a day's work. Inside, his heart was a war drum. The rider pulled up. He was a tall man with pale, cold eyes and a mustache stained with tobacco. He wasn't a local sheriff. He was federal, a U.S. Marshal. "Thomas Reich?" the Marshal asked, his voice flat. "That's me." The Marshal swung down from his horse, moving with a lazy confidence that set Thomas's teeth on edge. He pulled a folded paper from his saddlebag, a wanted poster. He held it out. Thomas didn't need to look at it. He knew. "Looking for an Apache woman. Goes by Isla Blackwater." The Marshal's eyes scanned the ranch, missing nothing. "Killed a cavalryman down near Fort Grant. Trail went cold. Then I heard a rumor. A rumor about you hiring an Apache woman a few months back. Around the same time this one disappeared." From the bedroom window, Isla watched, her heart frozen in her chest. She could see the sketch on the paper. It was her. Thomas gave a short, dismissive laugh. He hoped it sounded real. "Marshal, I've hired a half-dozen hands this year. They come and go. Can't keep track of 'em all. Haven't seen any lone Apache woman, though. Wouldn't last a week out here by herself." The lie felt clumsy in his mouth. He prayed it was enough. Marshal Cobb's lips twisted into a semblance of a smile. It didn't reach his cold eyes. "This one's different. She's a survivor. Got a description here." He glanced down at the poster. 5'7", maybe. Long black hair, and a distinctive scar on her right cheek. Through the window, Isla's fingers flew to the thin, pale line on her cheek. A permanent reminder of the soldier. The night he'd cornered her cousin. The night she'd delivered her people's justice. Thomas's mind raced. He had one card to play, a desperate, insane, all-or-nothing bluff. He forced himself to look surprised, then offended. "Marshal, the only woman on this property is my wife." The words hung in the air, a stunning, audacious lie. Cobb's eyes narrowed, the lazy confidence replaced by sharp suspicion. "Your wife? Last I heard, Thomas Reich was a widower. Buried your wife 3 years ago." The Marshal knew his name. He'd done his homework. This wasn't a random stop. "Remarried," Thomas said, his voice steady as a rock, a calm he absolutely did not feel washing over him. "Met her in Bisbee last month. Quiet ceremony." He gestured toward the house. "She's inside, resting, not feeling well." He had to sell it. He had to make it unshakable. He walked toward the door. "You're welcome to come in, have some water. but I'd ask you not to disturb her." He was inviting the wolf into the den. It was madness, but it was his only move. Cobb hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze boring into Thomas, searching for any crack in the facade. Then he nodded slowly. "Don't mind if I do." Inside the bedroom, Isla heard them enter. Her blood turned to ice. She was trapped. Her hand tightened on her knife. If that door opened, she wouldn't be taken alive. She listened to their footsteps, to Thomas's impossibly calm voice, offering the marshal a seat at the kitchen table. "So you remarried," Cobb said, his voice closer now. "Sudden." "Sometimes life moves faster than you plan," Thomas replied smoothly. He was pouring water. The sound was deafening. "Her name's Isabella, from a Spanish mission down south. Orphaned." He was building the lie, brick by painful brick. Then came the question that almost stopped Thomas's heart. "Mind if I see her?" Cobb asked. "Just to be sure. This Isle of Blackwater is dangerous. Wouldn't want you harboring a killer by mistake, mistaking her for some poor Spanish orphan." The silence stretched. Isla held her breath. This was it, the end of the line. Thomas let out a long, weary sigh. He sounded like a man at the end of his rope. "Marshal, I'll be honest with you. My wife, she's a shy woman, terrified of strangers, especially lawmen. Her family. They had a bad run-in with the law back where she's from. You go in that room, you'll scare her half to death. She won't come out for a week." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Between you and me, she's delicate, not like the women out here. It's why I married her. I needed some softness in my life again." He was painting a picture of a fragile, timid creature, the absolute opposite of the woman hiding in the next room. It was a masterful performance. Cobb was quiet for a long time. Isla could hear the creak of his chair as he leaned back. She imagined him weighing his options. Forcing his way into the bedroom of a man's wife was a line even a U.S. Marshal might hesitate to cross without more proof. "All right, Reich," Cobb said finally, his chair scraping the floor as he stood. "I'll take your word for it, for now." The threat hung in the air. "But I'll be in the area for a few days. If I hear anything at all, that makes me doubt your story, I'll be back, and I won't be so polite." Isla heard his footsteps cross the floor, the front door open and close, the sound of his horse galloping away. Still, she didn't move, not until she heard Thomas's heavy boots approach the bedroom door, followed by a soft knock. She opened the door to find him leaning against the frame, his face pale, his shirt soaked with sweat. He looked 10 years older than he had an hour ago. "You lied for me," she whispered, her voice tight with a mix of shock and something she couldn't name. "I did. Why?" He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a raw, tired certainty that shook her to her core. "Because he was here to take you, and I decided I'm not going to let him." That night, for the first time, she told him everything. She told him about Sergeant Miller, the cavalry soldier. She told him about the young Apache girl, barely a woman, who Miller had brutalized during the forced relocation. She told him how the army had looked the other way, how the girl's family had been shamed into silence. And she told him how she had tracked Miller for 3 days, waiting until he was alone, and delivered a justice that the white man's law would never provide. She told him about the blood, the fear, and the long weeks of running. When she finished, the fire had burned down to embers. The room was quiet. She expected him to look at her with disgust or fear. She had confessed to being a killer. Instead, Thomas Reich reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His grip was warm and solid. "He got what he deserved," he said, his voice a low growl. "And his fight is over. But ours is just beginning. Your fight is my fight now." Isla looked at their joined hands, a scarred, calloused rancher's hand covering the hand of an Apache warrior. It made no sense. It was impossible. But it was real. And in that moment she understood that the greatest danger wasn't the marshal who would surely return. The greatest danger was the hope that was beginning to blossom in her chest. Hope was a fragile thing in this land. It was easily killed. But Thomas was wrong about one thing. Marshal Cobb's fight wasn't over. He rode only a few miles before pulling his horse into a hidden arroyo. He hadn't believed a word of Reich's story. The man's hands, the hands of a rancher, had trembled just slightly when he poured the water. And his eyes held the desperate look of a man with everything to lose. Cobb wasn't leaving. He was just changing tactics. He made a cold camp and settled in for the night. He had Reich right where he wanted him, trapped by his own lie. Now all Cobb had to do was wait for him to make a mistake. And he would. Men in love always did. The lie settled over the ranch like a shroud. Thomas and Isla were no longer just a man and a woman. They were co-conspirators, bound by a dangerous secret. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that moved at the edge of the property, was Marshal Cobb returning. The peace they had found was gone, replaced by a constant humming tension. They had to live the lie now, not just for strangers, but for themselves. Thomas rode into town for supplies, his posture ramrod straight, a friendly nod for everyone he passed. He bought flour, beans, and a bolt of blue calico cloth. For the wife, he told the general store owner, a notorious gossip. She's been wanting to make some new dresses. The news spread through the town like wildfire. Thomas Reich, the grieving widower, had remarried, and no one had even seen the woman. The whispers started immediately. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why was he keeping her hidden away? Back at the ranch, Isla took the cloth. She hated dresses. They were impractical, a symbol of the world that had tried to erase hers. But she took the fabric and a needle and thread, and in the evenings by the firelight she would sit and sew, creating the costume for her new role. The shy, delicate Isabella. It felt like a betrayal of the woman she was, but it was a shield for the fugitive she had become. Days turned into a week. Cobb did not return. A fragile sense of normalcy began to creep back in. They started to believe just a little that he might have moved on, that the lie had worked. They were wrong. The neighboring ranch belonged to Jedediah Kane, a hard man with a greedy glint in his eye. Kane had always coveted Thomas's land, especially the creek that ran through it, a reliable source of water in a thirsty land. He saw Reich's strange sudden marriage and the subsequent isolation as a sign of weakness. One evening, Kane rode over, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, under the pretense of welcoming the new bride. Thomas met him on the porch, his body a solid wall blocking the door. "Heard congratulations are in order, Reich," Kane said, his eyes trying to peer past Thomas into the house. "Thought I'd come meet the missus." "She's not feeling up to visitors, Jedediah," Thomas said, his voice polite but firm. Kane's smile was thin. "Still, heard the same thing from the store owner. A man might start to think you're hiding something in there." The threat was veiled but clear. "The only thing I'm hiding, Kane, is my patience for nosy neighbors. Now, if you'll excuse me." Thomas turned to go back inside, a clear dismissal. Kane's voice stopped him. "Funny thing, I was in town a few days back, saw a wanted poster for an Apache woman. Looked a little like that ranch hand you used to have, the one that disappeared right around the time your new wife showed up." Thomas froze, his back to Kane. The air crackled. He turned slowly, his face a mask of stone. "You're on my land, Kane. I suggest you leave it." Kane just chuckled, a low, nasty sound. He took a swig of his whiskey. "Just saying. A man with water rights as good as yours. He should be careful. Lots of folks would be interested to know if he was harboring a wanted killer, especially Marshal Cobb. I hear he's still in the area. He knew. Kane knew, or at least suspected enough to make trouble. He wasn't just a nosy neighbor anymore. He was a threat, a man who could bring their world crashing down for his own personal gain. After Kane left, Thomas told Isla what had happened. She listened, her face impassive, but he saw the new tension in her shoulders. The circle was tightening. Cobb was out there, a predator in the distance, and now Kane was here, a snake in the grass coiled right at their feet. They were trapped between two different kinds of evil. That night, Isla didn't sew. She took out her knife and began to sharpen it on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound in the house. It was the sound of a warrior preparing for battle. The lie wasn't enough anymore. They needed a new plan. "He wants the water," Isla said, her eyes never leaving the blade. "Men like Kane, they are never satisfied. They take and take until there is nothing left. My people know this." "I won't let him take this ranch," Thomas vowed. "It's not the ranch he will take," she replied, her voice low and chilling. "It's you. He will use me to destroy you. Then the ranch will be his anyway." She was right. Kane wouldn't go to Cobb directly. Not yet. He would use the threat, leverage it to try and force Thomas to sell the land for a pittance. It was a slow, cruel game of extortion. A few days later, the first act of sabotage happened. A section of fence in the north pasture was cut. Not broken, but deliberately snipped with wire cutters. It took them half a day to round up the scattered cattle. Thomas knew it was Kane, but he had no proof. Then one of the wells turned brackish. The water was undrinkable. Isla, with her knowledge of the land, found the source, an animal carcass, deliberately thrown in upstream to poison the water source. It was a direct attack on their livelihood, on their survival. Thomas was a storm cloud of fury. He grabbed his rifle, ready to ride over to Kane's ranch and end it. It was Isla who stopped him. "You go there with a gun. You become the villain in his story," she said, her hand on his arm. "You prove him right. This is not a fight you can win with bullets. Not yet. You must use your head. Think like him. What does he not expect?" He looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a strategist. She had been fighting men like Kane her whole life. So they played a different game. They started watching. Isla, using the tracking skills her father had taught her, began to patrol the perimeter of the ranch at dawn and dusk. She moved like a ghost, leaving no trace, becoming one with the landscape she knew so well. She found footprints where they shouldn't be. A dropped matchstick near the hay barn. Signs that Kane, or one of his men, was getting bolder, creeping closer. One evening, she came back to the house, her face grim. She was carrying something in her hand, a small, intricately beaded pouch, an Apache medicine pouch. "I found this near the creek," she said, her voice tight. "It is not from my tribe, and it was not dropped by accident. It was left there for someone to find." Thomas didn't understand. "What does it mean?" "It is a message, a marker. Someone is watching us. Not Cobb, not Kane, someone else." The realization hit them both at the same time. They had been so focused on the threats they could see, they had never considered the ones they couldn't. Was it one of her people, someone who had followed her? A friend or an enemy who believed she had betrayed them by living with a white man? The ranch was no longer a fortress. It was a prison, and the walls were closing in from all sides. They were being watched by the law, by their neighbors, and now by a ghost from Isla's past. The pressure was becoming unbearable. The nights were sleepless, filled with listening for the sound of hoofbeats, the snap of a twig. The weight of the secret was crushing them. It was in one of these dark, pre-dawn moments that Isla finally revealed another piece of her story. "Sergeant Miller," she said into the darkness of the bedroom. "He was not just a random soldier." Thomas turned to her, sensing this was important. "What do you mean?" "He and his men, they were not just soldiers. They were thieves. They were using the army's movements as a cover. They were finding the secret places, the places my people have kept hidden for generations, burial sites, sacred caves." Her voice was laced with a cold fury. "They were stealing our history, our spirit, silver, turquoise, ceremonial masks, things that cannot be replaced." This changed everything. This wasn't just a revenge killing for a personal crime. This was about protecting the soul of her people. "The night I found him," she continued, her voice dropping lower, "he had something on him, a leather satchel. I took it. I didn't know what was inside until later." She slipped out of bed and went to her small pile of belongings. From a hidden pocket in her bedroll, she pulled out a worn leather book. A ledger. She opened it for Thomas. Inside were crudely drawn maps, lists of names and numbers. It was a record of their looting. It detailed every sacred site they had desecrated, every item they had stolen, and, most importantly, who they were selling it to. The list of names included powerful figures in the territory, businessmen, railroad magnates, and Jedediah Kane. Kane wasn't just trying to steal their water. He was a buyer of stolen Apache artifacts. Miller had been one of his suppliers. Isla hadn't just killed a soldier. She had cut off a vital link in a chain of corruption that ran deep into the territory. And now she held the proof. This ledger was a death sentence for every man named in it. Suddenly, Kane's aggression made perfect sense. He wasn't just a greedy neighbor. He was a terrified criminal. He must have realized who Isla was. He wasn't trying to get the ranch. He was trying to get the ledger. He was trying to silence the only witness who could connect him to Sergeant Miller's crimes. And what they didn't know was that Marshal Cobb was getting desperate. The senator, Miller's father, was putting immense pressure on him to find the killer and close the case. But Cobb had started to hear whispers. Whispers about Miller's side activities. He was beginning to suspect this was more than just a murder. He'd searched Miller's belongings and found a letter referencing a ledger. A ledger that detailed his illicit business. The bounty on Isla Blackwater wasn't just for murder anymore. Cobb had figured it out. He wasn't just hunting a killer. He was hunting for the evidence that could expose the whole conspiracy. He didn't just want Isla. He wanted that book. The next day, he decided he had waited long enough. He wasn't going to ride up to the front door this time. He was going to corner Thomas Rake alone. Thomas was checking the fence line on the far side of the property, miles from the house. He was mending the wire Kane's men had cut. He was concentrating, his back to the wide-open plains. He never heard Cobb approach. "We need to talk, Reich." Thomas spun around, his hand instinctively going for the pistol at his hip. Cobb was sitting on his horse 20 feet away, his rifle resting casually across his lap. "I'm tired of the games," Cobb said, his voice as cold as a winter morning. "I know she's here, and I know who she is, but I've come to realize she's not the one I'm really interested in." Thomas stood his ground, his face unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Cobb dismounted, walking slowly toward him. "Let me spell it out. Sergeant Miller wasn't just a soldier. He was a businessman. And he kept records, a little black book. I have reason to believe the woman you're hiding took it from his body. That book is now evidence in a federal investigation. It was a bluff. There was no federal investigation. There was just Cobb and the senator trying to clean up a mess." "I want the book, Reich," Cobb said, his voice dropping. "Your neighbor, Kane. He's been talking. He's very interested in that book, too. Seems his name might be in it. He's getting nervous. He's liable to do something stupid." Cobb laid out his offer. It wasn't an offer. It was an ultimatum. You have two choices. You give me the woman and the book, and I ride away. I'll even put in a good word for you. Say you were cooperating. Or, I deputize Kane and his men, and we come take them. We'll burn this ranch to the ground around you. No one will ask any questions. Just a tragic accident. A rancher and his mysterious wife caught in a fire. He let the threat hang in the air. You have 24 hours to decide. Cobb mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Thomas standing alone in the vast, silent landscape. The game had changed again. This wasn't just about hiding anymore. This was about war. He was no longer just protecting a woman. He was protecting the evidence that could bring down some of the most powerful men in Arizona. And he had 24 hours before all hell broke loose. He looked back toward his ranch house, a tiny speck in the distance. Isla was there. His home was there. Everything he had come to care about was in that one spot, and a storm of violence was about to descend upon it. Thomas rode back to the ranch like a man possessed. The ultimatum from Cobb echoed in his mind: the woman and the book, or fire and death. He burst into the house and told Isla everything: the false federal investigation, Kane's involvement, the 24-hour deadline. She listened, her face a calm mask, but he could see the storm in her eyes. When he finished, she didn't speak of running. She didn't speak of surrender. She simply walked to the fireplace and picked up the rifle leaning against the mantel. "My people did not run from thieves," she said, checking the ammunition. "We do not run now." It was a declaration. They were going to fight. But two people against Cobb, Kane, and however many men they could muster? It was suicide. They needed help. But who could they trust? The law was corrupt. Their neighbors were hostile or scared. Then Thomas thought of one person: Doc Miller. Not Sergeant Miller, but the old town doctor, a man he had known for years. Doc Miller had been a friend of his late wife, Martha. He was a grumpy, cynical man, but Thomas had always believed him to be decent. He was the closest thing Thomas had to a friend in this territory. He was their only hope. "I'm riding to town," Thomas announced. "I'm going to get Doc Miller. He can... I don't know. He can witness what happens. Get word out to a real lawman if things go bad." It was a flimsy plan, but it was the only one he had. "It is a risk," Isla warned. "Town is where their power is greatest." "It's a bigger risk to sit here and wait for them to burn us alive," he countered. He saddled his fastest horse. "Barricade the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me. Shoot anything that gets too close." He looked at her, standing in the doorway, the rifle held with an expert's ease. In that moment, she was the most terrifying and beautiful thing he had ever seen. He rode off, dust billowing behind him, praying he was making the right choice. He found Doc Miller in his office, smelling of antiseptic and whiskey. Thomas didn't waste time. He laid out the entire story, from Isla's arrival to Cobb's ultimatum. He held nothing back. He showed him the ledger, the proof. The doctor listened, his face grim, stroking his gray beard. When Thomas was done, the doctor was silent for a long time. He took the ledger and flipped through the pages, his eyes widening at the names he saw. "Good God, son," he finally whispered. "You've kicked over a hornet's nest of rattlesnakes." He looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with something that looked like pity. "What do you want me to do? I'm a doctor, not a gunslinger." "I need a witness, Doc. I need someone to ride out for the territorial marshals in Prescott if we don't make it through the night. Someone to show them this book. Someone to tell them what Cobb and Kane did here." Doc Miller sighed, a long, heavy sound. He looked old and tired. "All right, Thomas. For Martha's sake, I'll do it. It's insane, but I'll do it. You ride back. I'll close up here and follow you in an hour. I'll bring my medical bag. Sounds like you might need it." Relief washed over Thomas so powerfully he almost collapsed. They had an ally, a chance. He thanked the doctor and raced back to the ranch, his heart lighter than it had been in days. But Isla was right. Town was where their power was greatest. The moment Thomas left the doctor's office, Doc Miller didn't close up. He walked directly to the telegraph office. He didn't send a message to Prescott. He sent a message to Jedediah Kane, who was waiting with Marshal Cobb at his ranch. The message was short. He knows. He's coming for you now. Doc Miller wasn't a friend. He was one of them. His name was in the ledger, listed as the man who appraised the stolen artifacts and arranged for their transport east. He had been partners with Kane and Miller from the beginning. Thomas hadn't gone to their only ally. He had gone straight to the heart of the conspiracy. He had just told the enemy their exact position and confirmed their greatest fear. The trap was set. Thomas arrived back at the ranch as the sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody shades of orange and red. He told Isla the good news. Doc Miller is coming. He's on our side. But Isla was staring past him, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Then why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Is he riding with them? Thomas spun around. On the ridge where Cobb had watched them, a dozen riders were silhouetted against the dying sun. He could make out Cobb and the stout figure of Jedediah Kane, and riding beside them was Doc Miller. The betrayal hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had led them right to their door. He had sealed their fate. There was no more time for talk. They scrambled into the house, barricading the door with a heavy oak table, jamming shutters over the windows. The quiet ranch house transformed into a makeshift fort. Thomas took a position at the front window, Isla at the back. They had 2 rifles, 2 pistols, and about 100 rounds of ammunition. Outside, a dozen armed men were preparing to attack. The siege of Reich Ranch had begun. The first shot shattered the quiet of the twilight, splintering the wooden window frame next to Thomas's head. He fired back, not aiming to hit, but to show they were ready. The battle was joined. Kane's men, emboldened by their numbers, started to advance on the house from all sides, using the corral and outbuildings for cover. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the house, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. A lamp on the mantelpiece exploded. Thomas, the old soldier, felt a grim familiarity settle over him. The smell of gunpowder, the whine of ricochets, the adrenaline singing in his veins. But this wasn't a battle line with an army at his back. This was his home, and the woman fighting beside him was everything. Isla was a phantom. She moved from window to window, never staying in one place for more than a single shot. Her movements were economical and precise. She wasn't wasting ammunition. Every time her rifle cracked, one of Kane's men would cry out or dive for cover. She was a warrior defending her territory, and she was magnificent. For an hour they held them back. The sheer ferocity of their defense seemed to stun their attackers. But the numbers were against them, and Cobb was smart. He wasn't sending his men on a suicide charge. He was waiting. As darkness fell completely, a new threat emerged. A reddish glow began to build from the direction of the barn. "Fire," Isla said, her voice tight. "They are trying to burn us out." Thomas's heart sank. The barn was full of dry hay. It went up like a torch, the flames leaping 50 feet into the air, casting the entire ranch in a terrifying dancing light. It illuminated their fortress, turning them into perfect targets. But it also did something else. It cast long, deep shadows into the canyons and arroyos surrounding the ranch. And in those shadows, something was moving. Unseen by Cobb or Kane, a lone figure had been watching the events unfold from a high vantage point. It was the man who had left the medicine pouch. He had been tracking Isla for weeks, sent by her elders to ensure she was safe. He had watched her with the rancher, seen their bond grow, and had been torn about whether to intervene. But this This was an attack, a slaughter. He could not stand by. He slipped back into the darkness and sent a signal, the cry of a coyote, repeated 3 times. It was a call to arms. Back at the house, the situation was desperate. The fire from the barn was spreading, catching the dry grass. Smoke was beginning to seep through the walls. Kane's men were using the light to lay down a withering field of fire, pinning Thomas and Isla down. "They're making a final push," Thomas yelled over the din. He could see them gathering for a charge on the front door. He and Isla had maybe a dozen rounds left between them. This was the end. He looked at her across the smoke-filled room. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes burning with defiance. There was no fear there, only resolve. They would die here, together. And then, from the darkness behind Kane's men, a series of blood-curdling cries erupted. War cries. An arrow, fletched in black, hissed out of the night and buried itself in the chest of one of the attackers. Then another, and another. From the rocks and shadows, 4 Apache warriors emerged, knives and tomahawks in their hands. They fell upon Kane's men from the rear, a silent, deadly whirlwind of vengeance. The attackers, caught completely by surprise, panicked. Their organized assault dissolved into a chaotic scramble for survival. The leader of the warriors, the man who had been watching, was a blur of motion. He moved with a speed and grace that was almost supernatural. He engaged 2 of Kane's men at once, his tomahawk a deadly arc in the firelight. Inside the house, Thomas and Isla could only watch in stunned silence. "My brother," Isla whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Kia. They sent him to find me." The tide of the battle had turned in an instant. Cobb and Kane, seeing their advantage evaporate, tried to rally their terrified men. But it was too late. Kia and his warriors were cutting through them, evening the odds with terrifying efficiency. Jedediah Kane, in a desperate panic, made a run for the burning barn, hoping to use the chaos to escape. But Kia saw him. With a final, chilling war cry, he launched himself after the corrupt rancher. At the same time, Marshal Cobb, realizing the fight was lost, decided to cut his losses. But he wasn't leaving without the ledger. He made a mad dash for the house, kicking in the already weakened front door. He charged into the smoke-filled room and came face to face with Thomas Reich, whose pistol was now empty. Cobb raised his own revolver, a triumphant sneer on his face. "The book, Reich." "Now." Before he could fire, a shadow moved from the side. Isla. She launched herself at Cobb, not with a gun, but with the ferocity of a mountain lion. She slammed into him, her knife flashing. The gun went off, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Cobb was bigger and stronger, and he fought back, his hands closing around her throat. Thomas, seeing Isla choking, grabbed the barrel of his rifle and swung it like a club, smashing it into the side of Cobb's head. The marshal slumped, stunned. Isla scrambled free, gasping for air. Just then, 2 things happened at once. Kia emerged from the burning barn, dragging a whimpering, defeated Jedediah Kane behind him. And from the main road, the thunder of a dozen horses approaching at a full gallop. For a heart-stopping moment, everyone froze, thinking it was more of Kane's men. But these riders were organized. They wore the uniform of the United States Army. At their head rode a stern-faced colonel and a man in a dusty suit, a territorial marshal from Prescott. The honest law had arrived. The aftermath was a blur of confusion and explanations. The territorial marshal, acting on an anonymous tip about corruption and land grabbing, a tip sent days earlier by Kia, who suspected trouble was brewing, had been on his way to investigate Kane when he saw the fire and heard the gunshots. The ledger was the key. It was undeniable proof. With Kane and Doc Miller confessing to save their own skins, the entire conspiracy unraveled. The senator in Washington was implicated. The charges against Isla were re-examined, presented with the ledger and the testimony of the young girl Miller had assaulted. A military tribunal posthumously dishonorably discharged Sergeant Miller. The murder charge against Isla was changed to justifiable homicide in the defense of another. She was a free woman. As the sun rose on the smoldering remains of the barn, Isla and Kia spoke for the first time in over a year. Their reunion was quiet, a mix of Apache and shared glances, a mending of a bond that had been stretched but never broken. Kia looked at Thomas, not with hostility, but with a grudging respect. He had defended his sister. He had proven himself. In the weeks that followed, Reich Ranch began to heal. Kia and his warriors helped Thomas rebuild the barn, a silent offering of peace. The neighbors, seeing the truth of Cain's villainy, slowly started to come around, their fear replaced by a quiet respect for the man and woman who had refused to break. One evening, Thomas and Isla stood on the porch of the rebuilt ranch, watching the sunset paint the mountains. The land was quiet again. The ghosts, both his and hers, seemed to have finally found some peace. "My brother wants us to come and live with the tribe," Isla said softly. "He says you would be welcome." Thomas looked at her, at the woman who had walked out of the heat and turned his entire world upside down. He thought of the lonely, empty life he had been living before she arrived. "And what do you want?" he asked. Isla's hand found his. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "My mother once told me that a home is not the land beneath your feet. It is the person you stand beside." She looked out at the vast expanse of territory, land that had once belonged solely to her people. "This was my ancestors' land. Then it was your land. Now, I think it is our land." Thomas put his arm around her, pulling her close. He finally understood. He hadn't just found a ranch hand, or a lover, or a wife. He had found a partner, a warrior. He had found the other half of his own wild, battered soul. They had faced down the law, their neighbors, and a corrupt conspiracy. They had survived fire and betrayal. Together they would build something new, a home that wasn't Apache or white, but something in between, something stronger than both. Later that night, as they lay together, he gently traced the faint scar on her cheek, the last physical reminder of the fight that had brought her to him. "You know," he said quietly, "I think I might have been one of those wild ones, too. Just didn't know it until you showed up." Isla's hand covered his, her touch warm and sure in the darkness. "We both were," she answered, "and now we're free." The story of Thomas Reich and Isla Blackwater became a quiet legend in that part of the territory, a tale of two people from different worlds who found a common home on the unforgiving frontier. Their journey reminds us that sometimes the lines drawn on a map don't matter as much as the connections we draw between our hearts. If their story of courage and unlikely love resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button, because there are countless hidden histories from America's past waiting to be told. Let me know in the comments which part of their story moved you the most. Was it Thomas's unwavering loyalty, Isla's fierce fight for justice, or the way they built a bridge between their two worlds? And don't forget to share this with someone who loves a story about redemption, survival, and finding home in the most unexpected of places. Until next time, remember that the toughest frontiers are often the ones within ourselves.